Earlier today, I spoke with His Majesty the King to request the dissolution of Parliament. The King has granted this request, and we will have a general election on the 4th of July.
That was the moment Rishi Sunak put months of speculation to bed and fired the starting gun for a UK general election. That's our focus on this episode of Independent Thinking, the weekly podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox. As well as all the expected promises of domestic prosperity to come under another Conservative government, which were matched shortly afterwards by very similar from Labour, the Lib Dems and the SNP, Sunak emphasised the dark and dangerous world environment that is the backdrop to these polls. He gave a long list of reasons that the world is more dangerous than at any time since the Cold War. He included the war in Ukraine, Islamist extremism, China, migration, energy security. In short, he thrust foreign policy much further to the fore than it might normally be, and he made defence and security central to this election. There's also the question of why now? Rishi Sunak had until December to call the election. The polls are really not good for him at the moment. The answer, it seems, is the economy. Inflation figures are back to a historical normal, and that allowed Sunak to claim that he had restored economic stability as promised, even if the figures are not quite as good as he claimed. So we're going to go through all of this, the economic factors, the international threats, the decisions, and to do that, I'm joined by some of our experts here at Chatham House. Olivia O'Sullivan is director of our UK in the World programme, and before joining us, she worked for over a decade in international development and foreign policy in the UK government. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. And also with us is David Lubin, the Michael Klein Senior Research Fellow in our Global Economy and Finance programme, who was previously Managing Director and Head of Emerging Markets Economics at Citi. Hello, David.
Very happy to be here.
And last but absolutely not least is Tim Eaton, a Senior Research Fellow in our Middle East and North Africa programme. And he's worked extensively with Western policymakers in developing their policies on the Middle East and North Africa region. Thanks for joining us straight out of a long seminar.
Thank you very much. Good to be here too.
Great to have you all here. Well, look, let's start with this question of why now. Olivia, why has Rishi Sunak chosen to have the election on the 4th of July, in your view?
It may be that he thinks this is as good as it's going to get in terms of his party's electoral prospects. As you said, inflation figures have come down slightly.
David, just this point about inflation, it's come down, but not quite as much as they were hoping. And underneath it, some rather worrying signs if you unpick the figures.
Yes, that's right. I mean, the good news is that inflation rate in April of 2.3% is the lowest we've seen since the summer of 2021. And remember that inflation peaked at over 11% in October 2022. And in addition, there's more good news in the sense that the UK has a lower inflation rate than the United States, which is something that Britain can't often brag about. Then again, as you suggest, the reaction in the city was much more hostile to the inflation figures yesterday. Before the inflation figures came out, the market was suggesting that there might be 60 basis points, in other words, 0.6% of interest rate cuts during the course of 2024. After the inflation data came out, the market reduced its expectation of rate cuts this year to 40 basis points. And the reason for that was the stickiness of services inflation. So, although...
And this is based on things like wages.
That's right.
Services need people, which mean wages, and wages have been rising a lot. And so there are a lot of signs that this was actually perhaps going to go up again.
That's right. In addition to that, there may be some risk, which kind of speaks to Olivia's point, that things might get worse from here. Global commodity prices have been rising quite sharply recently. And when you look at the reason why British inflation fell so sharply during the course of 2023 and early 2024, falling commodity price inflation, or actually commodity price deflation, had a lot to do with it. And if commodity prices start to continue to rise over the next few months, then the inflation picture in the UK may once again become quite complicated.
Olivia, what about Rwanda in this decision to have an election?
Well, there have been suggestions that the government's Rwanda policy might explain the decision to call an election now. It's one of the few areas where there is a stark difference between the Conservatives and Labour on foreign policy. In some ways, both parties have moderated on foreign policy recently. The Tories from the era of seeking the hardest possible Brexit, Labour from the era when Jeremy Corbyn was their leader and they were much more radical on foreign policy. Now both emphasise their heritage and role of the UK in NATO, support for Ukraine, and a pragmatic approach to trade and alliances. But it's on immigration where there's a really stark difference. The government's Rwanda plan, which involves removing asylum seekers to Rwanda for their claims to be processed, and if those claims are successful, those asylum seekers will stay in Rwanda, which makes it distinct from the offshore processing schemes pursued by many other wealthy countries.
Like Australia.
Exactly, although Australia did do something similar to the Rwanda scheme. But it's important to emphasise that Rwanda is distinct. If not unique, it's distinct and it's unusual. Rishi Sunak initially proposed the policy in November 2023. The UK Supreme Court said it was unlawful because Rwanda, they did not consider a safe country. The government has since published a treaty with Rwanda where they introduced some safeguards, nominally addressing those issues, and also passed a bill declaring that Rwanda is a safe country. No flights has of yet taken off.
So how would this affect the choice of election date?
Sunak is potentially trying to say that if I win, the Rwanda policy will go ahead. Asylum seekers will be removed, and the basis on which he sells that policy, that it will be a deterrent to the asylum seekers who make small boat crossings over the English Channel, it will happen. Essentially, he's saying, or he has been saying, if you vote for me, it will go ahead. It's worth saying that it's not clear that it would go ahead anyway, because the policy is subject to legal challenges. And Labour, one of the areas in which they have really made themselves distinct is saying they would scrap the Rwanda plan, although they are otherwise keen to portray themselves as being strict, if that's the right term, on migration. They've talked about increasing border security, simplifying and making clearer the path to citizenship, but also pursuing returns agreements with EU countries and allies.
So to pick up your phrase, he might have thought there as well as on the economic front, this is as good as it gets, to offer a promise and not have to slog through the delivery. I can think one other way that having a rapid election helps him, and that is that Reform, the party formed out of Brexit party, doesn't really have a chance to get going and have candidates all over the place in a way that could take off some Conservative support. And we've had Nigel Farage saying, do you know, I'm not going to stand as an MP, I'm going to concentrate on the States, involving himself in the US election. But Olivia, you've thought of one or two other benefits, I think, of a summer election for him, or for anyone on the foreign policy front.
Well, before, when most people were anticipating an autumn election, the prospect ahead of us was a new UK Prime Minister, or rather a new government, walking into 10 Downing Street just in time, or maybe just after or before a US election, with the prospect of a second Trump term and all the questions that might raise about the US's relationship and role in European security. More generally, that would just be a huge challenge for any new government to immediately deal with on the foreign policy front. The 4th of July means instead a new government will be looking at a NATO summit in DC, and then the UK will be hosting the European Political Community Summit in mid-July, which is a format that brings together European countries, not just the EU. So it's an opportunity, a quick one. It's probably stressing out the civil servants preparing for those events right now, but to build some European and defence relationships for a new government before confronting the prospect of a shift in leadership in the US, if that is what happens.
So a launch pad, if you like, which the current government's having to do the work for, which it might inherit, but another government might also. Let's leave that question of why now. I'm going to come back to some of those points, including the economics, but let's go on to the key decisions that the next government is going to face very, very soon, as you said, from July onwards. Tim, let's start with the Middle East, which is not quiet. I mean, on paper, in terms of what they've said, Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak have said pretty much the same thing. We back Israel. We back its right to defend itself. We are very concerned, though, about the loss of life in Gaza. But Keir Starmer has taken heat in his party that Rishi Sunak hasn't, really, for taking that position from those who would like him to be far more critical of Israel. Can you just take us through what you think is going to happen in the next couple of months there and what kind of choices it will pose for Britain?
Well, I think the Israel-Palestine issue is particularly difficult for the Labour leader, given the previous debate and outcry about anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. I think that's constrained his political manoeuvring But really, from my understanding, the Labour Party has also not sought to build significant daylight between its position and the position of the Conservative Party in government, because ultimately, I think they want to retain a focus on domestic issues and not be drawn into debates about foreign policy. And I think that perhaps betrays a broader reality that the focus of the current government has certainly been highly domestic, and where it has reached the Middle East over the course of the last 14 years, and particularly, well, mostly since Brexit, of course, it's been in search of trade deals, and it's been quite difficult to locate British policy, really. That's felt like it's changed under David Cameron, with an invigoration of diplomacy, a much more present, much more vocal enunciation of British ideas and trying to connect to the US. But really, beyond those expressions, actually what British policy is tangibly is still quite difficult to identify in terms of practical action in the region. So in a sense, whilst this is a key issue in the Middle East, of course, and more widely, I would guess that a Labour government, if it comes in, will actually seek to distance itself to a degree from a front row seat on these issues.
Would you say that Britain has influence in the Middle East?
It certainly does. It's got a lot of historical relationships. Its policy hasn't always gone right in the region, as we know. But certainly leaders in the region do still look to the UK for leadership, for advice in terms of partnership. We hear regularly from people across the region, officials, publics, leaders, that they desire to work with the UK. I think what's been telling, though, is a kind of growing disengagement and lack of prioritization of the region in recent years. And that effectively the UK has pinned its approach to trying to be a free rider for US policy, sometimes even seeming to trial policies for the US and aligning itself so closely. That seems to have actually constrained its action perhaps more than anything else.
Olivia, in the report which Chatham House has put out, which you led on the decisions facing the next government, you were urging Britain or the next British government to look at exactly this kind of relationship that is not with superpowers, but is where Britain can have influence.
Certainly, in the report, we talked about the ways in which the UK can invest in the building blocks of a more effective foreign policy. There's no question the next government is going to have a very difficult economic inheritance. There aren't a lot of resources to put behind foreign policy. So the UK will need to think about getting the relationships right, particularly the US and China separately, and the US-China relationship will really make the weather for the next UK government on all kinds of things, not just conflict in the Middle East, but also we're seeing increasing protectionist trade practices, retaliatory tariffs between the two. The UK is outside of a major economic bloc, having left the EU, so it's going to have to pick its way through those measures and have a good sense of what its approach to its own economic security should be.
I'm going to move on. I'm just using your reference to China to move on to that. But just before we go into that, David, Olivia just referred to the tough financial background that the next government is going to face. We had Rachel Reeves and David Lammy, Shadow Chancellor and Shadow Foreign Secretary, on the Chatham House platform just hours before Rishi Sunak announced the next election. And Rachel Reeves was arguing that this is the most difficult financial circumstances for a government to inherit since the Second World War. What do you make of that?
I don't know about that precise comparison, but for sure it's difficult to argue against the proposition that money is tight. As Olivia was saying, the performance of the economy has not been great since, if you take 2019, just before COVID as a starting point, GDP has only increased in this country by 2%. In the United States, it's up by 10%. In the Eurozone, it's up by 4%. So in relative international terms, the performance of the British economy has not been great. And one, kind of consequence of that is that public finances are very stretched. The debt-GDP ratio is in excess of 100%, and we are spending a lot in this country. Public spending as a share of GDP is now around 45%. Historically, that's extremely high.
This is on things like health and education and defense and social services, all these things that people want.
Exactly, but the problem is that pressure for additional spending on those things, on defense, on aid, will only go up against a background where any government's ability to deliver those increases in spending might be constrained, because we're moving into quite unusual territory from a historical standpoint, which is to say that we've got this kind of combination of high debt, weak growth, and high interest rates. And that high interest rates means that the interest expenditure, the amount of public funding that needs to be devoted to servicing our debt, is high by historical standards. And that creates a kind of triangular trap for any government wanting to increase public spending. The constraints are very stark.
Let's go to this question of China, and you've spent a lot of time looking at China. And it seems to me Britain does have a difficult decision here, whether to keep trading with China quite as much, whether to accept the very cheap electric vehicles and solar panels that China very likely is going to offer us, or whether to try and bring in tariffs as the EU and the US might do, and just generally how to approach itself. We've heard a lot from both parties about trying to protect Britain more, but also about trying to trade at the same time. How should the next government get the balance right?
The difficulty is that when a government, any government, considers national security to be at the heart of its objectives, the problem is that national security has this kind of insatiable appetite. It gobbles up everything. Any issue area can be understood to have a national security component. So when it comes to areas of cooperation that one might wish to promote, for example, AI governance or pandemic preparedness, it's very difficult for Britain to kind of have a more cooperative stance towards Beijing because of this obsession that not only the UK, but many other governments in Europe and the United States, this obsession with security that seems to kind of crowd out anything else. And, I think the challenge for the next government is to find some way of carving out space that is somehow independent of this obsession with national security, that would kind of create some sort of corridor for dialogue with Beijing, because the cost of fully decoupling, the cost of just having nothing to do with the Chinese economy is enormous for an open economy like the United Kingdom's, in which economic performance in recent years has not been great.
You were listening to our event with Rachel Reeves into that discussion, and I was pressing her on whether security and economic growth pulled in different directions. The title of the remarks was about securonomics, her phrase. What did you make of the answer?
Her answer was vague, and I think it's vague because there is a sense in which security and growth do pull in opposite directions. The Chinese government, for example, these days talks about high-quality development rather than growth as a priority because its policy framework is overwhelmingly dominated by security concerns. And so there is this sense in which if a government is prioritizing security, then growth somehow comes in second. And, at a time when the overwhelming objective of policy is not efficiency, but security, that sacrifice of efficiency more or less arithmetically implies some kind of reduction in growth. And so there is a trade-off there. And whichever the new government is, has to be very careful about how they want to manage that trade-off.
Let's talk about the other superpower and the American election, which, as Olivia pointed out at the beginning, is now slightly further away, separated from the UK election than we first thought. Tim, if you put the figures of Biden and Trump into this whole picture, do you think, I want to ask you about the Middle East and what difference it makes, but also what difference you think it makes for Britain?
Well, I think going back to the discussion of how Britain formulates its foreign policy in a place like the Middle East, the extent to which it wishes to wed itself to American policy as seeing that as the route to the most influence is clearly difficult. If under a potential Trump administration, it'd be very hard to surmise what that policy might look like, if it might be very changeable, very difficult to pin down clear strategy. So I think that's certainly a fear. The unpredictability of the US as a potential partner with such an approach, I think, is something that Whitehall and the government has to take into account. And I think is why some analysts, such as myself, have suggested that maybe it's time for the UK to pick some things that it focuses on in a place like the Middle East. With the UK, I mean, it's got a lot of experience in conflict analysis and its response in the development sector, but those elements seem to have been de-emphasized in recent years. So it feels like it's at a point where it needs to really surmise its strategic opportunities and pick some things, because ultimately it doesn't have the capacity to have influence across the whole region. And I think just one final note on this with connection to US policy as well. Middle East policy is particularly difficult to compartmentalize at the moment. The transnational nature, the interconnectivity of what's happening in Israel to Syria to Iraq to Turkey is quite dizzying. So that requires quite a significant deployment of resources and thinking and strategic engagement.
And within all that, what would you suggest that Britain picks?
For me, I think issues around conflict resolution are a particular strength of the UK, its ability to talk to various actors. Much of my work focuses on a context such as Libya. I think that the deployment of capital, political capital into a conflict such as that could deliver some real results. But I think there are other options as well in terms of development, getting back to being more of a development leader. Ultimately, I think that the UK would have more bang for its buck if it focused on some specific objectives rather than trying to spread itself as thin as perhaps it has in recent years.
That's really interesting. Olivia is going to moderate a discussion in a few weeks for Chatham House. We will let you know the details about peacemaking and indeed whether Britain, this is a leading point, Olivia, whether Britain takes too many compliments for the record of Northern Ireland. But we'll come back to that in the future. Olivia, this business of the British relationship with an increasingly unpredictable America. What have you recommended the next Foreign Secretary and Prime Minister do?
To make an obvious point, it depends who wins. The Labour Party here are currently 20 points ahead in the polls. If it's a Biden-Starmer matchup, there is a lot of ideological common ground there, including on their approach to the ways in which foreign and domestic policy interact. So Rachel Reeves' Securenomics agenda, which David and you were just talking about, clearly takes some inspiration from Bidenomics to the extent that some would argue it's Bidenomics without the money. But there's some common ground that a Biden and Starmer, the two governments could find on what the Biden administration has sometimes called foreign policy for the middle class, this idea that the era of hyperglobalization is over and policy overseas should deliver a more stable and secure experience for ordinary people at home. Exactly as David said, the content of that, the meat on the bones of what that would mean in terms of the government's choices, are a bit difficult to discern. But there are certainly things and ideas which they would have in common. If it's Trump, then the UK is going to, I think, be like a lot of other European powers. They can take some cues from how it went last time in terms of anticipating a very transactional relationship and doing their best to get the most out of that. It's very clear that both David Lammy and the Conservative government, other political parties are available, are signalling that they would demonstrate to not just a Trump administration, but the wider US Congress and other decision makers that the UK carries its weight on defence, that we contribute to NATO. The exact amount that we would spend is somewhat up for debate. Sunak has pledged to hit 2.5% of GDP by 2030. Labour have said they'll do that when circumstances allow. But the UK is seeking to portray itself as a European country that is not a free rider. And I think they will continue to do that in the event of a Trump administration and try to play on that in order to counter his tendency to be transactional and to accuse Europeans of doing exactly that. There are wider issues if it's Trump because he's very unpredictable on global issues like climate, for example. And it may be that the UK needs to seek other alliances, partnerships, and relationships around the world to counter an America much less inclined to play that sort of problem-solving role.
David, in economic terms, is there much difference for Britain between Trump and Biden? I'm thinking of the way that Biden has talked about lots of tariffs himself.
When it comes to US policy towards China, there's not that much to divide Trump and Biden. So much so that actually you could argue that for all the kind of noise that Trump generated, Biden's policy towards China, particularly the October 2022 restrictions on exports of semiconductors and other high-tech equipment, was a really very constraining policy towards China. So in some respects, Biden has been tougher on China than Trump has. When it comes to Europe, though, I think Biden has a much more cooperative sense of what the US relationship with European countries should be than does Trump. Trump has a tendency, this kind of transactional tendency, to see everything in very kind of money terms, whereas Biden clearly places a lot more focus, a lot more emphasis on the quality and the importance of alliances. And so I would say from that perspective, the UK, whichever the next government is, has a more stable environment with the Biden administration.
And we've gone this far in the conversation without mentioning Europe, and that would have been centre stage in years past. I get the feeling very much from both main political parties that they don't much want to talk about Europe because there is very little room for manoeuvre. given that neither of them wants to say anything about joining the single market again, and nor would they want to accept freedom of movement.
Do you think security cooperation might be the most
I think it will
obvious
be, and I
path?
think that's what you've been talking about as well, Olivia. A lot of defence, a lot of security, stuff about students, veterinary agreement. But I was wondering if you thought the question of a customs union was completely beyond reach for another government once they got this election.
I think we heard that pretty loud and clear when David Lammy and Rachel Reeves came to Chatham House the other day. It was more or less completely ruled out, as far as I remember.
On the other hand, it wouldn't, I think, oblige them to consider freedom of movement, which is the real taboo for both political parties. Olivia, from your conversations, do you think it's really not on the political agenda, even some bit of paper in a bottom drawer, because both parties looking for growth, and it is closer economic relations with the EU are one of the ways that might be secured?
Well, there's a couple of issues with that proposal. One is whether the UK would be able to get the kind of carve-outs that it would probably seek. And one is whether a customs union would really deliver the growth and the benefits that it would want. So Turkey already has a customs union with the EU. And the concerns that Turkey has about that is it locks Turkey into any trade agreements that the EU makes with other countries. The UK, since Brexit, has been pursuing its own independent trade policy. There's plenty of debate about whether that's replaced or been as good as what it had with the EU. But if it tried to go back into customs union with the European Union, it would immediately have questions about whether its existing trade arrangements with other countries conflict with that. It also, arguably is moot because the European Commission is not going to be inclined to reopen the trade and cooperation agreement, which took years to agree, not going to be inclined to let the UK pick and choose the economic arrangements that it has with the European Union without signing up to the other aspects of being a member. The arrangement with Turkey is somewhat bespoke, has been difficult. So I think if it is Labour who win, and they are currently ahead in the polls, I think they will start by trying to reduce some of the frictions that exist in trade between
rather
the
than
EU
trying
and
a
UK.
big ambitious reconception of it. And you've given some very, very good reasons why
Exactly.
why not. And we don't have any suggestion that they are, as David said, that has been formally put down. David, what about Britain and development aid? I'm thinking particularly of its relationships in Africa and whether it has sacrificed more than it thought it was going to when it cut the aid budget.
I mean, you could argue that in the scheme of things, if the British aid budget is cut by, let's say $5-10 billion when you count in all the money that's spent on refugee accommodation in this country, in the big scheme of things, even $10 billion less of UK aid may not be noticed, given the hundreds of billions of dollars that flow internationally. So I think the cost to the UK is more diplomatic rather than a loss of economic benefit for the country's concerned. I mean, going back to Tim's point earlier about the sense in which the UK is a trusted partner, a country that other countries want to listen to, want to engage with, that diplomatic status, I think, gets undermined to some extent as the aid budget declines.
Tim, can I just take you into one aspect of British foreign policy we haven't talked about, and that's development aid and Britain's desire to use that to have relationships with countries, and yet it's jeopardized a lot of those relationships and that the effectiveness of that aid spending with cutting the amount of aid in recent years. Where do you think Britain would be best advised to take that?
Well, I think one of the underestimated elements of this as well has been the bureaucratic side of things with the folding in of DFID into the FCDO. I think I've seen firsthand that that's often led to slightly unhappy marriages or some slight differences of divergences of opinion in the way that political objectives are pursued in alignment with support through development projects. Clearly, I think it seems to underline a slight lack of direction of how to do that and how to do that most effectively, and slight clash of worldviews. So that's been pretty problematic from my perspective. I think that clearly there's been a slight reversion to the mean with the return of Andrew Mitchell alongside David Cameron, a slight back to the future aspect of that.
He's been
head
looking
team.
after development,
Right.
underneath the foreign secretary.
I think a safe pair of hands that understands the file, trying to align objectives in a clearer way. But for me, from someone who observes British policy on the ground, I think that that's somewhere where there's some work to do to perhaps iron out the wrinkles in some of those contradictions and understand what the strategic objectives are. It's fine to talk of slogans like Global Britain and seeking to utilize aid in favor of strategic engagement. But when such large amounts of it go on domestic spending with relation to migration, this is clearly moving a long way away from the initial desired objectives, and the cuts have been savage in many areas. So I think that really has undermined much of the leverage that British diplomats had in a lot of posts. And I think that's been keenly felt. Because
in a lot of countries in Africa as well.
Especially, yes, for the countries that I work on, cuts in approach to supporting conflict as well. One of those areas that I suggested Britain had a kind of comparative advantage also seems somewhat unstrategic.
So let's go finally to one country where the UK is trusted, at least at the moment, and that's Ukraine. The UK has been very much on the front foot saying, and this was not only under Rishi Sunak, but Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, that it was going to back Ukraine and send money and arms, and has urged other European countries to do so, urged the US to do so. Olivia, what decisions do you think the next government is going to face about Ukraine?
The UK has been a strong supporter of Ukraine to date, and it has injected some real clarity into the UK's foreign policy and given it a basis on which to deal with European allies. Since February 2022, the UK's given about 12.5 billion, the equivalent of 12.5 billion pounds in aid to Ukraine. And it's also played this galvanizing role. It's been prepared to deliver weapons and different types of weapons before other allies. It was very active in the beginning in coordinating with others in Europe and with the US the delivery of aid to Ukraine. So that's been a role that it has really been able to claim at a time when the rest of its relationships with Europe have been fraught. The questions that will now arise, especially if Trump does win the next US election, is whether it can continue to and whether it can afford to play that role if the US becomes very unpredictable on Ukraine. We've just had this long period where $60 billion in US aid to Ukraine was held up because of disagreements in Congress. During that time, most analyses suggest that even if they wanted to, European aid would not have been able to make up the gap. That's led to a lot of questions in Europe about whether, or rather among EU countries, about whether they need to cooperate more on defence industrial production, improve their defence industrial capacity. But most of their initiatives that seek to do that exclude third countries from defence industrial production. They privilege the EU defence industries. So the big short-term questions for the UK in terms of whether it can afford to continue keeping up that level of support. It has committed to do so recently for as long as Ukraine needs, I think was the phrase that Sunak and Lord Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, used. But long-term questions about whether it seeks to cooperate with the EU on galvanising defence industrial production and working together on defence industries. That will become quite fraught and quite difficult.
Thank you. And the Labour opposition has taken the same position. But again, we're coming into a very difficult summer for Ukraine, which is struggling to hold on to its territory at this point. And all those questions you've just mentioned are going to be very much at the fore. Well, let me come finally to each of you and just say if there's one bit of advice you wanted to give the next Foreign Secretary, which may be the current Foreign Secretary, what would that be?
Don't assume that conflicts that are not currently boiling over are solved in the Middle East. I think we've seen the flaw of that approach in Israel and Palestine, and the interconnections of the conflicts and the significant potential for escalation on so many fronts shows that actually there isn't a substitute for engagement to addressing conflicts at their source, as opposed to simply trying to mitigate them.
Do you have any conflicts in mind?
I think, unfortunately, there are several. If you look at the interconnections between what's happening in Syria with Turkey, with Iraq, you can see any number of potential inflection points, events in Iran. So it shows that actually looking at the local contexts is critical, but at the same time, that needs to be wedded to a regional approach which deals with those complexities. So that's easier said than done, but certainly won't be resolved by assuming that there can be a focus on one area to the ignorance of the others.
I thought you were going to say Libya, your speciality. We'll come back to
It
that
was
another
tempting.
time. It was tempting. And Olivia?
The UK has been through a period where its ability to be effective overseas has been constrained by domestic political turmoil at home. So I think I would say grand policy goals are good, but focus on the ability of the state to deliver and to stick to consistent goals, which sounds downbeat, but I think getting the basics right would be a good start.
Re-engage with the EU. It's very difficult to argue, I think, that the relatively lousy economic performance of the British economy has nothing to do with Brexit. And if, given the trap in which public finances find themselves at the moment, finding some way to boost growth creates fiscal space. And the most obvious way of doing that would be to re-engage with the European Union.
I entirely agree with that, and I'll add a final one, which is spend more, which is going to have to be out of the same very tight fiscal envelope. Yes, cutting into something domestic, but I think the UK is losing a lot, including potential for growth, from scrimping on defence development and diplomacy. On that note, a big thank you to my guests Olivia O'Sullivan, David Lubin and Tim Eaton. Do follow them all on X. Their details are in the show notes. We have done and will be doing lots more on these key issues of international affairs and how they play into this UK election. Do go to chathamhouse.org to read Olivia's report, which I've contributed to, on 3 foreign policy priorities for the next government. I've also written about these issues since the election was called, and we're going to be hosting events starting straight away next week. That's all on our website too. And a reminder that you can find all the episodes of Independent Thinking on all major podcast platforms, as well as through our social media. So please do like, follow and subscribe. After a week when even the best informed of insiders were caught by surprise, it's goodbye from us, from me, Bronwen Maddox. See you next week.